Hello everyone, and thanks for joining us today for what is the second webinar in our climate change mini-series, where we will look at ways in which you can play a part in tackling the current climate crisis. Over the past few years, we've been delivering webinars covering different aspects of renewables and domestic energy, and this work's funded by the Scottish Government as part of their support for home renewables and energy efficiency, which is there to help meet climate change targets, help Scottish householders lower their energy bills, and build a lower carbon economy. So as I mentioned, this is the second webinar in the climate change series. The first one in the series acted as an introduction to climate change, explaining what greenhouse gases are and what impact they're having on our environment. So I'd highly recommend watching this if you haven't done so already, as it will give you a good overview of the problem. So today's webinar, on the other hand, will help you identify solutions that you can adopt to help tackle climate change and live more sustainably. So we'll then finish off the mini-series next month with a third webinar, which will act as a real-world case study, demonstrating one person's approach to creating and living a more sustainable, low-carbon life. So before we start, I just wanted to cover a few housekeeping points. You can hear us, but we can't hear you. This is perfectly normal for webinars, so you have no reason to worry about any background noise. On your screen now, you should see the webinar control panel. Here you can type any questions you have or inform us of any issues you're having. Other listeners won't be able to see what you've typed, but we'll be monitoring comments throughout the webinar and we'll address questions at the end. Finally, this webinar is scheduled to last approximately 60 minutes and we'll be recording the session, so if you're unable to watch the whole webinar, then you can always watch it back at a more suitable time. So let's have a quick look at the agenda for today. First, I'll provide a quick recap of the core messages from the first webinar. I'll then demonstrate some of the ways you can save money and reduce your carbon emissions through behaviour change, improving energy efficiency in your home, and meeting your energy demands through renewable technologies. I'll then pass you over to my colleague Heather Quin from our Scottish Transport team, who is going to identify ways we can all travel more sustainably. We'll then hear from Iain MacLeod, who also works in our Scottish Transport team, but is importantly the chairman of our Green team and somewhat of a guru in the office when it comes to healthy, sustainable living. We'll then finish off the webinar with a Q&A session, so if you've got any questions, remember you can type these through the webinar panel. Okay, so let's first have a quick look at the problem which is driving all this change in our society. So we should have all heard of the greenhouse effect by now, but it can be a tricky one to describe. So a common misconception is that this is a man-made process that has no benefit, whereas that's simply not the case. The process starts with incoming solar radiation, warming the Earth's surface. This radiation is then reflected back into the atmosphere as infrared radiation, or heat. This is where it comes into contact with greenhouse gases, which absorb the heat and re-radiate it in all directions, which essentially results in an increased warming on the Earth's surface. So this is a natural process. It's critical to support life on Earth. Without it, things would be substantially colder, even here in Scotland. The enhanced greenhouse effect, however, is the result of human activity, where we increase the level of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, resulting in a greater level of heat absorption and re-radiation, warming the Earth's surface even further. This enhanced greenhouse effect is what is causing the warming of our climate, the destabilization of climate systems, and it's leading to an increase in the magnitude and frequency of extreme events. So how do we know this isn't all just theory and recent increases in temperature aren't just part of a natural cycle? Well, you'll need to watch our first webinar in the series, as that's too much to cover today. What is important to remember is that burning fossil fuels releases various greenhouse gas emissions, which in turn increase average global temperatures, which in turn influence the kind of physical Earth systems. So what do we mean by fossil fuels? What we're talking about here is coal, oil, and natural gas. They're fuels because they release heat energy when they're burned, and they're fossil fuels because they were formed from the remains of living organisms millions of years ago. Our lifestyles completely rely on fossil fuels. We burn them for everything, from heating our homes, powering our appliances, traveling to work, going on holiday, or producing the food that we eat. But there are solutions that address each of these sectors that we'll look to address today. So here we have a breakdown of the fuel sources used to produce electricity in Scotland in 2017. As we can see in the graph, 51% of the electricity generated in Scotland is produced from renewable sources, with a further 37% being generated by zero carbon nuclear energy, the environmental impacts of which are for a separate discussion. What's important to note is that this has not always been the case, and it's taken great leadership and investment to get where we are now. Not everyone agrees with the aesthetics of wind turbines, but they've allowed us to make progress in decarbonising our electricity generation, with a milestone being achieved in 2016 when Longannet was shut down, and that was the final remaining coal power plant in Scotland, which was in operation for nearly half a century and was capable of producing enough electricity to power a quarter of Scotland's homes. So it was an incredible achievement in its own right, but something society must evolve beyond. So this is electricity generation in Scotland, but what about energy generation as a whole? Here we have a breakdown of the fuels used to meet our energy demand across all sectors in Scotland. As you can see, we still heavily rely on fossil fuels, primarily driven by our need for heat generation and transport. It's not such a good picture, but it's something we must address if we want to decarbonise our economy. So what can we do as individuals? There's this belief, or sometimes an excuse, that industry is causing the problem and they can do more. While it's true that more can be done within industry, it's also true that more can be done within the domestic sector. So on the left there, you'll see a chart of the total energy consumption of Scotland, broken down into the industry and commercial sector in green, the domestic sector in blue, the transport sector in yellow, with the corresponding carbon emissions for each sector displayed in the right-hand chart. As you can see, the domestic sector makes up 31% of total energy consumption in Scotland. That's a significant proportion of our demand, which is responsible for causing 29% of the total carbon emissions. Likewise, the transport sector represents 27% of our energy demand and contributes towards 29% of total emissions. So though there's a lot that we as individuals can do to help reduce these figures, though it might seem like an insurmountable task, it is feasible, and we have been doing some incredible work in Scotland so far. As inventors of the steam engine, which kick-started the whole industrial revolution, I'm proud to see Scotland embracing its responsibility here and committing to help lead the world towards decarbonisation through ambitious carbon reduction targets, continued investment in renewables, and research and development into new technologies. So the previous chart showed the Scotland's domestic sector made up 31% of total energy consumption, or 29% of emissions. This chart shows what we mean by domestic energy, all the energy requirements in a typical home. So as you can see, space heating and hot water make up the vast majority of our domestic energy demand. And in order to reduce carbon emissions in the domestic sector, our focus must be on improving energy efficiency to reduce our demand, and then ensuring that the remaining energy is met from low carbon sources of energy. So what is energy efficiency? In plain English, it's about reducing the amount of energy we use. So this can be achieved in two key ways. We can reduce our demand for energy by changing our behaviour and installing efficient appliances, or we can reduce heat loss from our homes by improving the thermal performance of the building, our property's envelope. By envelope, I mean the roofs, the walls, the floors, the windows, the doors. Basically the external surface of the property, which separates the heat internal space from the cooler outside environment. Basically the barrier that stops heat escaping. So that being said, we all know that there are costs associated with improving the energy efficiency of your home. So before we look at some solutions, let's consider what actions we can all take to reduce carbon and save money without spending a penny. So here's a table showing typical savings that can be achieved for different behavioural changes. In this instance, by typical, we just mean a gas-heated 3-bedroom semi-detached property. So looking at the table, it's clear there's a significant amount of money and carbon that can be saved if we simply changed our habits. For example, turning your central heating thermostat down 1 degrees could save £80 and 340 kilograms of carbon dioxide every year. A common misconception is that turning a thermostat up will heat a home quicker, but that will only heat the home to a higher temperature at the same rate. So if you really want to increase the rate that your home heats up, you'll need to reduce heat loss by insulating the building. Another change for those that use a tumble dryer is if you were to dry your clothes outside in the summer, you can save on average £35 off your electricity bill and 60 kilograms of carbon dioxide each year. And another change is if you were to avoid standby and ensure that you turn off appliances when you're not using them, you could save an additional £30 and up to 60 kilograms of carbon dioxide. So now I'm not going to go through everything in that list as they won't apply to everyone, and the potential benefits from behaviour change really depend on an individual's circumstances and how they use energy. But I wanted to include this just to illustrate that there are a lot of changes that we can make in our daily habits which can lead to significant savings at no extra cost. However, behaviour change can only go so far, so really to decarbonise our lifestyles we need to improve the thermal performance of our homes and reduce heat loss. So this picture illustrates typical proportion of heat loss for different aspects of the building for an uninsulated 3-bedroom semi-detached home. Many people find this kind of an illustration useful as it helps them determine where renovations and improvements should be focused. For example, why would you go through the disruption of insulating your floors to target 8% of heat loss when you could insulate your loft, target 26% of heat loss for what is often a fraction of the cost? So let's have a look now at some examples of energy efficiency improvements you can make around your home to address this heat loss. So here we have some typical savings that can be achieved by improving thermal efficiency in your home. So I don't have time to cover all the points, but if you remember the image from the previous slide, a typical uninsulated property loses about a quarter of the heat through the roof. Thankfully, the majority of homes have some loft insulation, but many don't have the recommended 270 millimeters. From the table, you can see that if a home has no insulation, installing 270 millimeters could save up to £135 a year and 550 kilograms of carbon dioxide. Alternatively, topping up your loft insulation from 120 mils to 270 millimeters could save around £12 and 50 kilograms of carbon dioxide. So a typical uninsulated property loses about a third of their heat through the walls. The likelihood of your property being insulated is very much dependent on the wall type and when it was built. So the latest Scottish Housing Condition Survey found that 75% of cavity wall properties are insulated, yet only 18% of solid wall properties are. From the table you can see that insulating a cavity wall typically leads to £150 and 620 kilograms of savings per year, and insulating a solid stone wall typically leads to £260 and over a tonne of carbon each year. So these are just a few examples of the savings from insulating some of the more common energy efficiency improvements in your home. So yeah, we looked at energy efficiency by making changes to your behaviour, and you've reduced heat loss in your home. So the next step is to consider ways you can meet your remaining energy demand from low carbon sources. So this is where renewables come in. So renewable energy is that which is obtained from a naturally replenished source. Importantly, the full definition incorporates human timescales. So although oil is formed... Hello? Okay, I think I might have been leaning on the mute button on my headset, which, so apologies for that, we've come to the root of the problem. But yeah, so the definition includes human timescales. So although things like oil are formed from the remains of living organisms, it takes millions of years to replenish the reserves, so it's not considered a renewable energy form. What we mean more by renewable energy is the daily radiation we receive from the sun, the winds we're subjected to from changing pressures, the rain that we experience in Scotland, which ensures our rivers never run dry, and the tides that form from gravitational pulls of the sun and the moon. So these are all natural forms of energy that we can harness and transform into another form of energy. So wind energy, for example, in its raw form, is not going to power your lights. Likewise, waves aren't going to heat your home. So renewable energy technologies are those which transform these natural energy forms into usable energy forms, such as electricity and heat. So let's have a look at some of the renewable technologies that might be suitable for you and your home. So when we're talking about renewable electricity generating technologies, we're talking about systems such as solar photovoltaics, wind turbines, and hydroelectric generators. I'm sure everyone will have seen solar PV during their time. These are the panels you'll see sitting on roofs. They capture light from the sun and convert it into electricity. So they require an area that's ideally unshaded, faces between southeast, southwest, and tilted at kind of 30 degrees from the horizon. So it's important to note that they only produce electricity during sunlight hours. So you need to consider when you require electricity to determine which technology is suitable for you. Solar PV is incredibly reliable technology. There's no moving parts, and this means that life expectancy can exceed kind of 25 years. Micro wind is another one. Basically, micro wind just means small wind turbine. This is where you have 2-3 blades attached to a rotor, which is connected to a generator. So as energy contained in the wind is transferred into the blades, the rotor begins to spin, creates electricity through the generator. Majority of homes in Scotland aren't suitable. It requires sufficient wind speed, which comes with higher exposed elevations. It's important to know that generation is also unpredictable. Wind doesn't always blow, so it's not always possible to meet your electricity demand throughout the year. Micro hydro, like micro wind, is just a term for small domestic scale micro or hydroelectric generators. They essentially use running water to generate electricity. And as you can imagine, there are not many suitable properties in Scotland as you require access to a river and sufficient flow. But they can be a reliable source of generation, especially if the flow of the river is continuous throughout the year. So these technologies represent a great way of powering your lighting and your appliances from zero carbon free electricity. There are additional benefits for householders that are on electric heating systems such as storage heaters and heat pumps, as you'll be generating the electricity used to provide space heating and hot water. Furthermore, since you generate your own electricity, you no longer need to purchase as much from your energy supplier, leading to a reduction in your energy bills. So these technologies aren't suitable for everyone. It very much depends on the type of property you have, what resources you have available, and how you use energy in your home. If you're unsure whether a particular technology is suitable, then it's worth noting that we offer a specialist renewables advice service, which is delivered by Home Energy Scotland. This is where a specialist advisor can help you to determine whether a renewable technology is suitable for you and your home. And it's all free and impartial, so you've got nothing to lose. Apart from renewable electricity generating technologies, you also have heat generating technologies. The most common being solar thermal, biomass, and heat pumps. So the one on the left there is solar thermal or solar hot water, which is mounted on your roof, similar to solar PV. The collectors absorb heat from the sun throughout the day, which is used to heat your hot water, and then that can be stored in a hot water tank until you need it. It's important to note that these systems are not capable of providing space heating and are more suited for properties with high hot water usage. So keeping in mind things like your electric showers, dishwashers, washing machines, they take cold water and heat them up internally using electricity. So installing solar thermal is not necessarily suitable. However, if you have a mixer shower, you regularly take baths or wash dishes by hand, then your hot water demand will be higher, and solar thermal may be a suitable way of kind of reducing your costs and carbon. Biomass is another renewable heating technology. It uses wood as a source of fuel. Lots of different types, from small stoves that heat individual rooms to boilers which provide heating and hot water for your whole house. So the boilers are larger than your standard boiler, so you'll need a reasonable amount of space to install it, along with space to store fuel. Unlike other forms, you can store biomass, so you can use it when you need it. So there's no issues with intermittency. You don't need to wait for the sun to shine or the wind to blow. Heat pumps are another renewable heating technology. They come in a variety of different types depending on the source of the heat and how it's distributed. So in very simple terms, heat from the outside air, ground or water is absorbed by the system into a fluid called a refrigerant. This passes through a compressor which increases its temperature, and then that heat is then transferred into the home's heating and hot water circuits. The analogy of a fridge in reverse works well, as the technologies are basically very similar. So instead of taking heat from inside the fridge and moving it to the back, heat is taken from the air, ground or water and moved inside the house. So heat pumps use electricity to power the different components. So if this electricity comes from the grid, then it's not necessarily renewable. However, due to the efficiency of the system itself, they can actually output about 4 or 5 units of heat for every unit of electricity used to power the components. Now, if you think back to the charts I showed at the beginning, they illustrated 3 points. First, the majority of energy consumed in the domestic energy sector is derived from fossil fuels. Second point was the majority of energy consumed in the domestic energy sector is used for space heating and hot water. And the third point was the majority of grid electricity is generated from low carbon sources of energy. So what this represents is an opportunity to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels by transforming our heating and hot water systems so that they are powered by electricity generated from renewables and other low carbon technologies. So over the coming years, we're going to see a big push globally to electrify our heat and transport sectors to help tackle climate change, which leads me nicely to pass you over to my colleague, Heather Quin, who is going to give you an overview of some of the ways you can reduce your carbon emissions associated with transport. So I hope you've all found that useful, and remember, if you have any questions, you can type these through the panel and we'll address these at the end. Okay, so over.
Perfect, thanks Scott. Hi there, so my name is Heather Quin. I work in the Scottish Transport team at the Energy Saving Trust. And it's worth noting that Scottish Transport at EST is funded by Transport Scotland, an agency of the Scottish Government. I'm just going to give a quick snapshot overview into the issues with our transport system, but also the behaviours and investments that you can make in your everyday lives to reduce your carbon emissions when travelling. So as Scott discussed, around about a third of our emissions come from transport, and of that you can see the breakdown there. 40% are from passenger cars and the majority are associated with road transport. Part of the problem with this is that more and more people are driving. We've got 3 million motor vehicles licensed in Scotland. That's the highest it's ever been in Scotland, and as you can see by that graph, it's growing. But also it's down to the types of vehicles that we're choosing. So SUV sales or service utility vehicle sales are increasing year on year. It's only set to increase to around about 41% by 2021. And these cars are bigger, they're more powerful, and they actually produce 15% more carbon emissions than your average car on the road. Also, there's been little change in transport when comparing it to other sectors. So when you look at energy supply over the past 27 years, that's reduced by over 73%, and waste management 72%. Even agriculture has almost reduced its emissions by 30%. But over the past 27 years, transport has only reduced by 3.7%, excluding international aviation and shipping, which has increased quite dramatically. But over the past year, between 2016 and 2017, our transport emissions actually increased by 2%. And it's not just greenhouse gases that are an issue with transport. They heavily contribute to poor air quality. So in Scotland, poor air quality causes over 2,500 deaths every year, and the sort of emissions of huge concern is carbon dioxide, which is actually an irritant, and it comes out of the exhaust of vehicles. It causes respiratory illnesses and infections, can worsen conditions such as asthma. And then you've got particulate matters, which comes out of the exhaust, but it's also comes off the tyres of your vehicles, the brake pads of your vehicles, and even from road debris. The numbers next to that, next to the PM there, relate to the size of the particles. So PM2.5 are, really ultra fine particles, and when those are breathed in, they get carried all around our body, deep into our lungs, through our bloodstream, into our hearts, into our brains. Really nasty stuff, and there's loads of links to particulate matter to strokes, asthma, heart and lung disease, and even certain cancers. But Scottish Government has set quite ambitious targets and policies. So one of the most famous targets is to phase out the need for petrol diesel vehicles in Scotland by 2032. And also Scotland are going to establish low emission zones in 4 of the major cities in Scotland. And it's not all bad news either, because as you saw, 40% of our transport emissions are associated with passenger cars. And there's actually a lot of solutions and alternatives available for that. So all it requires is, small changes and really simple changes as well. So some of the behaviours I'm going to talk about today are simple, but that's the beauty of them. So we recommend that you focus on, shifting your journeys up the travel hierarchy as often as possible. And this is what we mean by the travel hierarchy. So replacing your short local car journeys with active travel where possible, and even, utilising public transport services that are available to you. Where you do need to take the car, try to share your journeys with people as often as possible, but also try to make plans to ensure that your next car is electric. So when we're breaking it down and we're looking at air travel, there's no secret that air travel is a huge emitter. So if you're flying from Glasgow to London, rail is 82% less carbon intensive than air travel. Greta Thunberg famously sailed across the Atlantic to get to New York, 3,000 miles to avoid flying. We don't expect you to show that level of commitment, but even if you can choose, you can look for good deals, try to choose rail where possible, especially for domestic flights. It can often be a lot more convenient to take the train. It's a better use of your time. You can stay connected. You can still work from the train. You can email people. It tends to be more direct. There's more station options for rail. Airports tend to be situated quite far away from city centres. So even if you're getting to the airport, how long does it take you to get there, and are you paying for a taxi? Are you paying parking charges? So there's a lot of things to consider when looking at your journeys. In Sweden, they are tackling the social norms with flying. So they actually have the word flygskam, which is quite a new word, and it directly translates to flight shame. And they also have the word tagstert, which translates to train brag. And because of this shift in social norms, 23% of Swedes have committed to reducing their air travel, which is really, really positive. And then shifting to electric vehicles. So when we're talking about electric vehicles, we're talking about cars or vans that can be plugged in and powered by electricity through the motor. Sometimes this is combined with petrol, but for the purpose of today, I'm going to be talking about pure electric vehicles, so run only on electric. So there's zero tailpipe, and that means greener, as Scott talked about. Our national grid is only getting greener with the growth of the renewable sector, which is fantastic. And the range of EVs is only getting better as well. The market's growing. Currently, the average range is 150 miles, but this is only going to get better. And second-hand electric vehicles are starting to appear in the market too, which is fantastic. As you can see, there's a 69% CO2 saving. And for people charging from home who are driving sort of the average 8,500 miles a year, you could save up to £900 on fuel. But of course, you can also car share as well. Getting an electric vehicle is not an instant change you can make in your life, but if you can car share as often as possible, this can help with congestion issues that are often seen in urban areas, which contribute really heavily to poor air quality. If you're going to sort of big events such as festivals, or even to your workplace, those are ideal opportunities to use to car share, and there's a lot of websites that you can utilize to help you do this. For example, Lyft Share being one. Car clubs as well, as you saw from one of my first graphs, 29% of households in Scotland have 2 or more cars in their household. We speak to quite a few people who have a second car, but sometimes it's barely used. It's maybe used once a month for the big shop, or it's they rely on that car to get themselves up north for their holidays once or twice a year. Those cars could be replaced by car clubs, by car club vehicles, and the vehicles within car clubs tend to be newer, which means they're more efficient, 33% less CO2 than the average car, but they also tend to be safer and nicer to drive as well. In Scotland, we are sort of looking at options for what's known as mobility as a service, which brings sort of all modes of transport together, helping people make more informed decisions on how they can travel, accessing shared and public travel, and not relying so heavily on the private car. So hopefully, with MaaS or mobility as a service systems coming into play in the next few years, the number of car club cars on the road will only increase to support MaaS, and the number of private vehicles will decrease, hopefully. But we are also trying to move people away from cars as much as possible because of their contribution to emissions and their contribution to congestion and air quality. So public transport is a good solution for that. As you can see, rail uses 74% less CO2 per passenger than a car. That's only going to improve because the Scottish Government have set a target to decarbonise and electrify Scotland's rail system by 2035. So all trains will be electric. Where they can't be electric, they're looking at battery-powered trains and even hydrogen fuel cell trains as a sort of last resort. And also the bus, buses get quite a bad rap for their emissions, and there are some older buses out there on the road, but it's still better to shift towards the bus over the car because of the impact that can have on reducing congestion. But also bus technology is improving. In Edinburgh, there's a lot of hybrid buses out there on the road. Aberdeen have a fleet of hydrogen fuel cell buses, and there's a lot of retrofit options available to help reduce the amount of nitrogen dioxide and particulate matter that are coming out of bus exhausts. So there are solutions available there as well. And when we're talking about active travel, we're referring to cycling and walking. So cycling is one of the most efficient ways to get around. It's the greenest. It is zero carbon. When during your rides, if you own the bike, it doesn't cost you anything. There's no denying the huge health benefits associated with cycling. It's a really great way to stay active just from getting to A to B. And if you are sort of new to cycling and you're a bit nervous about going out on the roads, you can always ask a colleague or a friend to cycle with you, maybe to trial a couple of trips and get a cycle buddy system going to build your confidence before you commit to doing it longer term. But as well, if you're concerned about maybe fitness or health issues, or maybe you just live just a little bit far away that puts you off cycling, or you live at the top of a hill or work at the top of a hill, electric bikes or e-bikes can be a good solution for you. So the electric motor on board can help you get up those hills with little effort. As I said, it reduces the amount of effort required. It's extremely low cost as well. The cost of electricity to charge these things is it's about 12 pence for 100 miles, and as you can see, the savings you can make are huge as well. And finally, walking. It's the top of the hierarchy. It's the most efficient way to travel. It's the most accessible way to travel as well. And it sounds extremely simple, but the beauty of it is. It's how we were designed to travel as humans. And so the more and more that we can do that, the better. There are huge hosts of health benefits associated with walking as well. It is still classed as exercise, even though it doesn't always feel like it. It can reduce our chance of heart disease by 35%, and you get instant health and well-being benefits. It's proven to reduce anxiety, reduce stress levels, improve our posture. The health benefits of walking are huge, so we would encourage you to try it as often as possible. And that's again, just try it. You know, you don't need to get rid of your car. You can just commit to at least once a week if you work. If you don't work, maybe walk to the shops and then get the bus back with your shopping. You know, you can just try it here and there, but it can make a huge difference. And as you can see, can save you some money as well. So, as I said, a lot of what I've talked about, you could start implementing in your day-to-day lives now. You know, you can walk more, you can dust off the cobwebs on the bike that's in your garage, you can choose public transport as often as possible. But some of the suggestions I've made, such as shifting to electric vehicles or even shifting to an e-bike, do require some investment for yourself. And in Scotland, we do have financial support available. So there's an interest-free loan for over 4 years. So there's up to £6,000 per household available. That's £3,000 per new e-bike or £6,000 for a new e-cargo bike if you need to carry a heavy load. And we also have an electric vehicle loan as well, so up to £35,000 interest-free, repayable over 6 years, and that's towards the purchase of a new electric vehicle. And if you do get an electric vehicle, there's charge point funding available. So there's £500 available from the UK Government's Office of Low Emission Vehicles. But in Scotland, there's a further £300 top-up grant to cover any remaining install costs as well. And if you want any further advice on anything I've talked about, you can call Home Energy Scotland. And if you are interested in any of the funding we have available, again, Home Energy Scotland can help you with that. So I'm going to pass over to my colleague Iain MacLeod, who's going to talk about sustainable eating.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you, Heather. Yes, as I said earlier, I work in the transport team here with Heather, but I also head up the green team, which is a group within the organisation that works helping people sort of make changes to their lifestyles that can hopefully encourage them to live a little bit lower impact. So yeah, starting with looking at diet, which is quite a substantial part of anyone's carbon footprint. Just to put it in context, the current global average carbon footprint is 5 tonnes per person, whilst for the UK it's a little over that, about 5.5 tonnes. At that rate, to stay within the 1.5 degrees of targeted as part of the Paris Climate Agreement, we will burn through our entire carbon budget within sort of 10 to 15 years. There's a bit of sort of range there because of some uncertainties, but it just really helps to emphasize the urgency of us cutting down our emissions as quickly as possible. Agriculture currently makes up about 11% of UK emissions and 12.5% of global emissions. However, the problem with agriculture is quite difficult to decarbonise relative to some other sectors. For instance, electricity, which Scott went through earlier, explaining how that can be already quite low carbon in Scotland and can be made more so, and transport and heat, which can both be electrified and thereby by extension also made lower carbon. For reasons such as it requires some sort of quite energy intensive processes, such as the manufacture of fertilizer. Some of the larger vehicles that are required as part of farming are more difficult to electrify, and by the fact that it demands much higher land use, which by land given over to agriculture is not available for instance, forests and so forth, and other things which can help to hold carbon. People obviously, however, do need to eat. It's not like if you really want to cut down your footprint, you could cut out flying, you could get rid of your car. Eating's not really negotiable, unfortunately. So at least for the next few years until science solves that one, that is how it will remain. However, different diets can have different impacts. So I've pulled this from a BBC article, which you might recognize from last year, which just demonstrates, it's a meta study pulling numerous studies together, just showing how basically meat has much higher impact, and other animal-derived products have much higher impacts than ones such as from plants. This graph actually quite helpfully shows how there's a range in terms of that impact, but even the lowest impact red meat diet, because red meat tends to have the highest impact, is still significantly higher carbon intensity than more plant-based things such as tofu, beans, and nuts that are at the bottom. A person who regularly eats high-impact meat, red meat, sort of daily consumption of beef, will easily add 5 tons to their carbon footprint over the course of a year, so doubling that figure that was in the last slide. So the question of why meat is higher impact, there's numerous reasons for it, but it basically boils down to efficiencies. As you get further from the sun, there's energy efficiency losses along each step, which means, for instance, you get from the sun to the plants which produce their energy from the sun, and then the things which eat the plants. And for instance, a cow, not only does it eat the plant, not all energy turns into cow mass, but it also takes many years, lots of plants to go into it to turn it into a cow that can be turned into meat. And there are a number of other environmental factors that are tied up with carbon, for instance, water use, and going back to land intensity, use of land, and pesticides, other such factors. But so yeah, the kind of take home is the closer you can get to the sun, the better. And whilst again we're not able to photosynthesize as yet, therefore your best bet is to look at plant-based products if you want to reduce your footprint. Some people might argue, you see this coming up sort of now, that a vegetarian diet is sort of quite a lot more vegetarian, but with some meat may be optimal. As what this allows for is the fact that there's some land that isn't really viable for agriculture, such as sort of hill uplands and so forth, where you can raise meat and not at the expense of what would otherwise be viable agricultural land for crops and so forth. Which does certainly make some sense, but what this disregards is an idea of natural climate solutions, or rewilding as it is sometimes called, whereby if we allow these areas to regenerate with what would be there otherwise, which will vary depending what part of the world it could be national woodland, jungle, mangroves, peatland, marshes, in the seabed, kettle forest, and so forth. These different things can do a huge amount to take on board carbon as they grow and sequester it over their lives, and the difference that can make, because this study I've cited here shows that can get us over a third of the way to the carbon reduction we need to keep our climate below 2 degrees by 2030. Another factor, obviously, a lot of people traditionally have avoided eating animal products is for reasons of concern of animal welfare. So some people who perhaps aren't willing to go as far as eschewing animal products altogether opt instead for things that are considered more ethical, such as grass-reared, grass-fed organic products as opposed to factory farming. Whilst this is indisputably better for the animal's welfare, the flip side of that is, unfortunately, it does tend to have a much higher carbon and environmental footprint. Witness the environmental destruction in the Amazon that's taking place at the moment, as wildfires are increasing as a result of cattle ranchers chopping down forests to raise cattle. If you're concerned about both, the likely solution is to opt out for both and select neither, which of course leads you to the question of vegetarian or vegan diet. So if you question which of these you want to go with, one thing to just sort of note of caution, vegetarian diet, when people who switch from meat eating to vegetarian often will find that they compensate for the lack of meat by seriously increasing the amount of cheese they eat, but cheese is actually quite has a significant carbon impact in and of itself, comparable to a lot of the non-red meats. So you may find if you do this, you're actually offsetting a lot of the benefits in terms of environmental side from switching out meat. Again, and also you have similar, maybe not quite as drastic, but there are still issues with animal welfare if that is also a concern for you. So for that reason, if you really want to make a really big impact, then you could think about eventually aiming to go as far as vegan. How to do this, whether it's cutting down, cutting out meat and dairy, my advice would be not to do too much too fast. Don't set the target too high for yourself, because it will just make it all the more challenging to meet. Cut out red meat first would be the most sensible thing, whether you do it wholesale, no red meat again, or just much more of a treat, much rarer occasion. And other meats, generally, you could reduce the amount you have per meal. If you eat meat every meal, then try and reduce that, or perhaps you can have a couple of vegetarian days per week. Key thing, though, is if you're certain this is what you want to do, then just don't be discouraged by setbacks, because obviously you may find challenges if you're making sort of significant adjustments to your lifestyle, but as you go on, you'll find it gets easier, as with all things. But don't beat yourself up if you do occasionally not manage to keep it up. Also worth mentioning, there are, of course, health considerations if you're thinking of switching to vegetarian or vegan. Vegan diets in particular, there's a lot of nutrients which people will struggle to get as much of as they will, and which are very prevalent in a rich meat-eating diet. I've listed sort of some of the main ones there, but worth noting, certainly in the case of iron and zinc, there are non-meat alternatives that you can use to get these from. And for some of the other ones, you can either take supplements, or a lot of foods out now are heavily fortified with these. So it needn't be a reason to keep you from making this change. And there's lots of information out there now. There's books, there's blogs that can help you do this, but you may well want to consult your doctor or dietitian depending on how far you want to go with this. But I would certainly say that just because of the sheer number of vegetarians and vegans out there now, there's significant amount of products have merged to meet their appetite, so it has never been an easier time to go vegetarian or vegan. Other benefits you can potentially see, a vegan diet in and of itself isn't necessarily healthier, but just by virtue of a lot of the things you'll find you're cutting out, for such as high fat, salty foods, people are likely to see such things as potentially losing weight, cholesterol going down, lower blood pressure, which are all obviously quite positive health metrics. Some people, more anecdotally, often report that they just feel better having made this switch, which may well be to do because some of the sort of less healthy, less good for you foods that they are cutting out. And from my own experience, having gone largely vegan, something I feel is that I definitely think that food tastes better now. And there is, again, from researching for this webinar, I find there's some evidence to back this up. At least one study looking at people who are switched from a high to a low fat diet, not necessarily vegan, but again, by virtue of being vegan, you're probably cutting out a lot of fat. They increased their sensitivity to a particular fatty acid, and thereby foods which this was sort of existed in. And it's not unreasonable to expect that might extend to other foods. It's certainly the case that whenever I cook for people, they tend to say that I haven't put enough salt in it. So I think that's what's going on. It's certainly nothing against my cooking. So yeah, just moving on to sort of reducing consumption and waste in the home. So this isn't quite as significant as in terms of carbon, but it's still every little thing you can do, and it's still a sort of significant part of your life and so forth. You'll likely have heard of the 3 R's: reduce, reuse, and recycle. Sometimes people put refuse at the start of that, which you kind of say is part of reduce. I would stress here that those are in order. I think a lot of people are very into recycling these days, but they still tend to have quite high consumerist lifestyles, when the key point is reduce is the first thing you need to be doing. What you can't avoid getting, try and make sure you reuse it. And once you've reused it to the point you can no longer use it anymore, make sure you recycle it. And finally, compost, which I put at the bottom, but more to the side, it is very important, even though it doesn't start with an R. If all these things, compost is definitely something you should be doing, because food that ends up in the bin, that ends up at landfill, can turn to methane, which is an even more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So it's one of the best things to do and one of the worst things not to do in terms of trying to reduce your emissions. Reducing, so basically if you don't need something, then think about not getting it. But sometimes you do need something, and so it's trying to question of what is the best way to do it. And this can throw up sort of some challenges. For instance, if you're trying to weigh up whether it's better to get a stainless steel bottle or a single-use plastic bottle, the single-use plastic bottle will use much less energy, and so have much less greenhouse gas emissions associated with it. However, it's only 15 times. So if you use the stainless steel bottle 15 times, you've already got sort of broken even carbon wise, and you've any more use it, you're carbon credit, and you've also avoided 15 plus plastic bottles going out in the environment, ending up in the land, in the sea, in animals in the sea, and ended up in the food chain like that. A cotton tote bag, by contrast, which is quite a popular accessory by people who are seeking sort of a shun plastic, a study in Denmark recently demonstrated can be 150 times worse in terms of carbon emissions than single-use plastic, and even more when you consider other environmental factors with that. So here, if you have plastic bags for life, keep using them. you know, when they get dirty, just wash them. Those things can last for ages rather than going for the cotton tote bag. I mean, I know it's obviously there's issues with plastic, but that's kind of, if you can have to do the two, better to keep the cotton tote bag if you had it, but otherwise stick with the plastic bags for life. And just generally getting fewer new things. Reusing things, getting things repaired, when rather than getting new ones, you could try clothes swap with your friends, other people, people you don't know, organize something like that. And taking old things like jars, once you've whatever you got in the jar has been used, just fill it up with something else. You can, or turn it into something else entirely, upcycle it, turn it into a food container, into a plant pot, for instance. Recycling, as I said, this is third in the chain, but absolutely you must make sure you are still doing this. The glass, tin, aluminium, paper recycling industry is well established, and so works quite effectively. The plastic industry, unfortunately, is not quite where we would like it to be at this stage. There's a lot of plastic which isn't yet able to be recycled effectively. A lot of it is downcycled. A lot of it just ends up in landfill, even if you think if it, you know, it's ideally should be being recycled. So this needs to improve, but sometimes this is just even down to sort of cultural change. For instance, some colors of plastic are actually harder to recycle and therefore more expensive to recycle and less economically viable to do so. And it may just be for the reason that the manufacturer thinks that the food that the plastic is packaging is more attractive, more appealing if it's in black than clear plastic, and so they opt for that. So consumers need to be aware of these things and to be willing to sort of make these changes to meet the needs to reduce this. So in terms of what you can do, as I said, you'll get a reusable water bottle, get a coffee keep cup if you have these a lot, and make sure you take them with you. Maybe, as I said, a plastic bag's better than a tote bag, or reuse it, just keep using it and using it. Only to get the things you'll need, and you know, if you're getting cooking, for instance, make sure you try and cook in bulk, reduce packaging that way. You can set a target for yourself, reduce how many things you're going to get in a year, for instance. Think about things where you might have previously have gotten new ones. Can you just, you know, can you extend your phone track? Do you really need to get a new one? Other things, do you really need a new version? Can you upgrade it? Buying fewer clothes, swapping clothes. And something which I find quite satisfying is just getting to know your local tailor. You may find you have a lot of things that you think are past their best, but you take them on, you find that they can do wonders on them and you won't even know there's anything wrong with them. It's not always a straightforward relationship. I have tailors near me who have knocked me back on no fewer than 2 occasions because of bags I've tried to take to get repaired, and they've told me that it's not worth anyone's time. I should just get new ones. But I went home and I got a needle and thread and I did it myself, and you can see there it is looking as good as new.
Okay, yeah, thanks Iain for that. That was very insightful. And yeah, my thanks to Heather as well. Yeah, it's a lot of changes that we can all make in our lifestyles to help kind of reduce the impacts of our activities on the climate. I just want to take a moment just to highlight that this is a huge topic and it's impossible to do it justice in an hour without being very generic. So if you want to find out how you specifically can make a difference, then you should call Home Energy Scotland. It's the numbers there on the screen. We've got advisors across Scotland who are ready to give you free and impartial advice on how you can save money and reduce carbon. So whether it's from energy efficiency and renewables to transport and resource efficiency, they're all very informed and they offer a fantastic service that we're all very proud of. So that being said, we have a few questions here. We've got a couple of minutes, so we'll be quick. There's one here, improving energy efficiency is expensive. Is there any funding available? Yes, there is. It's not something I covered in my presentation. But yeah, so up in Scotland, if you're looking for support with upfront costs for energy efficiency improvements, renewable energy, even energy storage, or even connections to a district heating scheme, then yeah, you can access funding through the Home Energy Scotland loan. It's interest free and you pay back based on how much you borrow, but that can be as long as 10 years. For renewables, I guess the UK government, if you're generating heat from a renewable technology, you can apply to the renewable heat incentive. You can get funding just for generating the renewable heat and you'll get paid quarterly for 7 years. From the 1st of January, the Smart Export Guarantee will be introduced where you'll be paid for any electricity you don't consume in your property and you export to the grid. So additional stream of income there. I think Heather covered a couple. They've got the electric vehicle loan. You've also got a charge point grant. I think there's a UK-wide grant there, but in Scotland you can get an additional top-up on that as well. But yeah, there's a whole host of funding. There's a lot of grants available, but it depends on where you live, if you're on benefits, and if your property has a certain energy efficiency. So if you call Home Energy Scotland, they can see what you're eligible for. If there's any means testing required, they can do that as well. So there's one here for you, Heather. How much does an e-bike cost? The 3,000 sounds like a lot for a bike.
Yeah, so 3,000 is quite steep. So we would recommend anywhere between, you want to get good quality e-bikes, so you can get something as little as £500, but I would say the quality of the parts on the bike are going to be quite poor. You can absolutely get e-bikes for, around £2,000, £3,000, way up to, £6,000, but those are sort of your luxury sport performance models. But you can get a really decent bike for between £1,000 and £2,000. The beauty of the loan is that you can spread out the costs over time, and if you're getting a bike around about that price, I think it's like around £1,500, that actually works out cheaper than paying sort of your average monthly bus pass a month. So if you are replacing car journeys and you are replacing your car, you will make that money back in fuel savings.
Okay, great. Thanks for that, Heather. Iain, there's one there in relation to food miles. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, okay, yeah, thanks for that. So yeah, that's didn't quite have time to go into food miles, but obviously that's something that people talk about a lot in terms of carbon emissions associated with food. It is an important factor, but it's worth bearing in mind that it's a relatively small part of the total emissions bound up in your food. It's at least one study I found cited at about 5%. So do what you can to reduce your food miles, absolutely, but bear in mind that some of these other changes that I spoke about earlier can have a bigger impact. One point which I think finds quite interesting is the difference in emissions between food that's shipped versus food that's flown is 100-fold. So it's 100 times worse in terms of carbon emissions to get food flown than to have it shipped, which is pretty significant. Which is why I find it quite frustrating. It can often be very difficult to find out from when you're in the shops whether food was flown or shipped in, when it can make quite a significant difference in terms of its environmental impact.
Okay, great. Okay, unfortunately, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. My thanks to you all for joining the session. Special thanks to Iain and Heather for their time and contribution. If you've enjoyed today's webinar, then we've got a final one in the climate change series is scheduled for the 30th of January. We'll be joined by one of the householders on our Green Homes network, who has made many of the changes we've highlighted today. So this will be a great opportunity to hear just about one person's journey to living a more sustainable life. But what we'll do is we'll send out further details along with a link to the recording of this webinar in the coming days. So hope you've found this interesting, and thank you for watching.